But I always think that it's important to start with our family origin story. And our families have a profound impact on kind of our early formative years, and in many ways shape the way we see and interact with the world. So I'm going to share a little bit about my family origin story. So I'm a fourth generation Japanese American who grew up in the south end of Seattle, just up I-5. I actually consider myself very, very lucky to have grown up in a very racially diverse and modest income neighborhood. I went to school with other kids who looked like me. I had teachers, coaches, advisors, people in my community who served as role models and reflected the diversity of the community in which I lived. And in hindsight, that was an incredibly affirming experience. I am also one of two daughters, and I don't ever recall ever hearing any limitations on what I should or could not do because of my gender identity. When I was applying for college, interestingly enough, my dad actually encouraged me to major in a STEM field, and his reasoning was because of the lack of women representation. But the thing that he didn't know was that I was just kind of mediocre in math, which is kind of a slight issue. I barely passed my calculus class as a senior in high school, and I think ended up repeating it here in my freshman year at UPS. But I've been interviewing my father a lot. He is aging, and it's in kind of the last chapter of his life. And one of the questions I did ask him was, did he ever wish he had a son? And without pause, he emphatically said to me, no, I never even thought about it. So in hindsight, and I wrote that down, Mary, I'm just not saying that. In hindsight, my formative years were really affirming ones for me. It affirmed my identity as an Asian American, Japanese American, and it also was affirming of me as a woman. And those are two identities that I proudly claim today. So it was actually not until I came to college in the mid-1980s, which I recognize for some of you, you're like doing the math going, man, she went to school in the Stone Age here. But it wasn't until I actually came to campus that I actually realized that I was a racial minority, as I was just one of a handful of students of color here on campus. And it was the first time that I experienced today what we would call microaggressions. I didn't have that language in the 1980s. But there were comments that I received from other students, I hate to say, teachers, about how good my English was. There were stereotypes about, God, how can you eat all of that raw fish? And then one student came up to me and said, oh, from Hawaii, right? And I'm like, no, we actually grow here too. So all of those things in hindsight were benign. But nonetheless, they were hurtful. And it was a bit of a rude awakening, I think, for me at the age of 18, that perhaps the world would not be as affirming as I was led to believe in those very early years of my life. And perhaps it was foreshadowing of some things that would come. I want to also, though, acknowledge, though, despite some of the hurtful experiences here at the university, I also found my voice here. I ran a campaign. I was elected as chair of the Student Senate. I took time to bring social justice speakers to here on campus. There was a point in time where there were a number of cherry trees that lined the pathway from the rotunda to the buildings here. And that was as a result of myself and other student activists that had those trees planted on behalf of the Japanese American students whose educations were interrupted and, for all intents and purposes, ended because of their incarceration during World War II. So I also want to acknowledge that this was a place that was open to me, that said, we hear you, and you do have a place to make change here on campus. So as I moved from my school life into my work life, I began to realize that some of the barriers that I faced in the workplace were associated with some of the cultural values that I held. And kind of unbeknownst to me at the time, impeded my effectiveness. And so what's kind of one example of that? So there was one cultural value in particular that may resonate for some of you in the audience who identify as Asian American, and that value was on humility and modesty. It was imbued in me from a very young age that whatever I accomplished, I really shouldn't talk about it, because it might be perceived as bragging or touting my own horn. And I think I actually learned to downplay areas where I found some measure of success. And so while the culture and the family I came from placed a high premium kind of on this modesty, the manifestation of those values in the workplace actually did not really serve me well. I had a boss that once told me, Jill, just when I'm about to tell you what an awesome job you did on something, you don't even let me start before you start talking about all the things that you could have done differently, or the things that you may have missed. And he said to me, why do you do that? Why do you undermine yourself? Why do you undermine the good work that you're doing? And I, in that moment, was taken aback. I had no idea that those cultural values, right, that were imbued in me from so long ago were being perceived in this way. And it was like a light bulb went off for me. And so I don't know if some of that resonates for some of you, but hope to talk about that a little bit later. But it took me many, many years to get comfortable with taking credit for a job well done and for kind of owning my own contributions in leadership. So I want to talk about leadership a little bit. I am fairly convinced that leadership is a learned behavior. That, yeah, there are a few of us maybe that are natural-born leaders, but many, and maybe even most of us, develop that capability over time. And I've worked in the private, public, and philanthropic sectors, and much of the leadership that was modeled for me, and as Mary mentioned as well, was anchored in a white, male-dominant culture. And so as I was moving along in my career, I attempted to model that same kind of leadership. But increasingly, as time marched on, there was a dissonance between my authentic self and who I was attempting to be. And that was becoming unsustainable. I was not being me, as Mary would say. Someone described to me this phenomenon as, kind of wearing your favorite comfy jacket and coming to the front door of your office place or your workplace, taking it off, and then having to put a straight jacket on, right? When you attempt to be someone who you're not, it can be oppressive, it can be suffocating, and at its worst, it can be soul-crushing. And so at some point, and this didn't happen overnight, I decided to own and live into my own brand and style of leadership. It was truly the only way I could be most effective, and once I did, it ultimately served me well. So, as Mary would say, I be me. A final comment on the importance of representation, and Nicole touched on this in narratives. It is so important for us to see Asian American leadership and representation in all sectors of our society. The outsider kind of foreigner narrative and stereotyping surrounding Asian Americans, many of you know this, is one that stems, as far back as the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1800s, and many of you in the community are doing such tremendous work around the healing around that period of time. But on the basis of race, right, Chinese immigrants were denied U.S. citizenship. And this form of othering has been stubbornly pervasive and persistent for far too long. If we fast forward to the last 18 months, this same scapegoating, this same othering has manifested itself, as President Crawford mentioned, in anti-Asian sentiment, in violence and hate. In its worst forms, we saw the loss of Asian women's lives to horrific violence in Atlanta. We saw our seniors in broad daylight being abused and assaulted. And that has got to stop. So the perception that we are somehow not American or un-American, there's a lot that goes into changing that narrative. And I would assert, though, that the power of representation, of seeing Asian Americans in positions of influence, is at least one way that we begin to change this othering and this narrative. I have a client, and I won't bore you with the details of what I'm doing, but in doing some research for this client, I found this really great quote by the prolific American author James Baldwin. And as I was preparing my comments, I thought, oh my gosh, that quote is so appropriate for today's conversation. So James Baldwin said in 1979, and this was in an interview with the New York Times, he said, quote, "The world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter, even by a millimeter, the way people look at reality, then you can change the world." So if Baldwin is correct, it matters so much that we see Justice Mary Yu sitting on the bench of the highest court in this state. And in a field dominated by white men, seeing Nicole as a highly successful entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, that matters. And so for all of you who will represent us and the generations that will come forward, use that voice. Represent us, use your leadership, and I can almost guarantee we'll continue to see change evolve into the future. So thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.